Hi everybody, I'm Diana Wall. I'm the Director of the School of Global Environmental Sustainability. And we are really pleased tonight to have Liz Neeley back with us. For those of you who don't know, this is an event for us. We, every year, choose 20 graduate students or postdocs across this campus. Imagine just 20 from the whole campus. And then we put them through a program that lasts a year, but starts with today, all day tomorrow and the next day, of training these young scientists, these young people, these early career people to communicate, and to communicate without using jargon and be able to tell their mothers and their fathers and their aunts and their uncles why they do what they do. Liz is really a special person for us because as we have had this cohort now, 20 students every year for the last, I think this is the 5th year, we build a network with them. And they all remember Liz and her training and how she has taught them. It is a real interesting interaction to see today and then what will happen tomorrow and how much they learn from the journalists that come here, because Liz knows a lot of journalists in this country. And what's amazing is when she says, I've got a really good group at Colorado State University. Can you come? They usually jump and say, yes, I want to be here. I want to hear what the students and the postdocs are doing at Colorado State University. I will come and be there to help train these science, these young students and postdocs on a one-to-one basis. Her background is in science. Her love of communicating science is going to be very obvious, and so I'll just leave it. Welcome back. Good to have you.
Thank you. Everybody, and welcome. I'm actually curious, how many of you have seen me give this public talk for the past 4 years? Any long-timers? We got a few. It's a joy to be here, and this is a time of transition, not only for the new fellows who are embarking on the training starting tomorrow, but also for me as I move from the position I've had at Compass for the past 7 years as the Assistant Director of Science Outreach to a new position. I'm now the Executive Director of a group called the Story Collider. And so in the best sort of academic tradition, I thought I would use the public talk tonight as an opportunity to start sharing some of the ideas I've been kicking around, show you the history of these thoughts we've been having about why stories are important, how do they work, what do we know about the research on them, and then most importantly, how do we as scientists and science communicators employ them in an ethical way. So that's what I'm going to be working on tonight. And we are battling a number of tech issues. We'll see if this works. I'm not live tweeting my own talk. I'm actually controlling the presentation from the iPhone. So for those of you who are tweeting and on Twitter, we encourage that, we welcome that, and we have a hashtag for the day today. It's #CompassMeeting. And this is the SOJA's fellowship program. I'm at Lindsay. And so I wanted to begin with walking the talk and telling you a little bit about my own personal history. So as you heard Diana mention, I'm a marine biologist by training. I started my work in the evolution of color patterns and visual systems in tropical reef fish. So in these environments, I was really interested in asking questions about what do these fish look like to each other, not to humans. Are they cryptic? Are they conspicuous? What's going on here? And so really the question was, when you have a signaler with a message they want to transmit, how does that information make its way to the receiver? What is going on in terms of perception, in terms of the way that that water media is changing the light signals between when it leaves that body and hits my eye as the fish? So as most of you guys who have done field work know, a lot of my graduate work looked a little bit like this. It's dark, it is dark and murky, and a lot of it like this. Sequencer was doing some genetics work. And after long hours in the lab of trying to figure out what kinds of questions I was pursuing and what I was making of the data that we collected, I was presenting materials at science conferences that looked like this. So I really thought that I had this whole science communication thing down pat, right? And I remember so clearly thinking, I've got my elevator speech. Let me tell you, because I still remember. I used to say, oh, I study the synonymous to non-synonymous substitution ratios in the transmembrane regions of rhodopsins and wrasses. Nailed it, right? And in a sense, that was precisely what I was doing. And to my audiences in those contexts, that was great, that made sense. I was really lucky that there was a science journalist who saw me give one of these talks who helped me through a few more steps down that road. Susan Milius writes for Science News, and she ended up covering some of my work. We went through several iterations on the phone. She called me back after getting off the phone with Dr. Justin Marshall, and he was a rock star. I loved his stuff. And I was all excited, and she's like, Liz, calm down. Can you explain to me how your work relates to his new paper? So anyway, it came out long form, which means several pages of this, and she nailed it. It was spot on. I was the kicker, the last 3 paragraphs. And when I read her explanation of what I was doing, she said I was studying visual pollution, and wasn't it a shame that just as we were starting to understand these signals, we were drowning them out in polluted reef environments. I thought, this is amazing. If only I'd been able to say that earlier, people might have been more interested in what I was doing. So after I left grad school, I took the skills that I had about science synthesis and trying to gather and interpret data, and went into the nonprofit sort of conservation advocacy world. I started with a group called CWeb. I worked on issues like, this is called kid-safe seafood. It's the idea that pregnant moms are trying to make a lot of decisions. They're getting conflicting advice about omega-3 fatty acids and also mercury and PCB levels in fish. Layer on top of that some sustainability concerns, and you've got a nightmare. So how can we provide simple advice for what these women can do? I also have a passion for women's fashion. And we saw deep sea corals coming down the high fashion runways in Milan and Paris. We realized this was a huge opportunity to talk about deep sea creatures that most people have no idea are animals, much less how many of the described species of scleractinians and other kinds of corals live in the deep sea, so below 60 meters. And that project ended up looking like this. It was a high-end fashion campaign with Tiffany & Co. as a major partner and donor on this. It had policy outcomes, so we were working to try and get international tracking in the trade of these deep sea corals. And it was getting covered in places like Mademoiselle and Vogue and Marie Claire and women's magazines like that. And so this was sort of the way I was going, and I was thinking, this is so exciting, it's so great. But my job, it was challenging because in many instances, the story was so seductive that people are tempted to overreach, to make things sound even more powerful or important because they care so deeply about the issues. And so what I wanted to do was stop sort of clawing people back saying the data doesn't support that, you can't say that, and instead turn around and start pushing scientists and say, you can say more than you are right now. We do know certain things that you can bring into the public consciousness or conversation. And so this was where I transitioned to Compass. Compass is a nonprofit organization founded 15 years ago by Dr. Jane Levchenko. You might recognize her name. She's the NOAA, was past NOAA administrator and an extraordinary marine ecologist. She's the past president of a number of prestigious science societies, including AAAS, which publishes science. And this paper about a new social contract for science was the transcript of her presidential address to her colleagues, arguing that researchers needed to tackle science research problems in proportion to their urgency to society and the world, that they needed to disseminate their knowledge widely, and that they needed to do all of this with a good measure of humility and sort of good humor. So this is what founded Compass. And as we worked there, I specialized in connecting journalists to researchers, as you heard Diana mention. We realized that scientists walk into all these discussions about the media with certain ideas in their head about how this works. So let me tell you that story, and it's a fairy tale. Right? Once upon a time, there was a public lost, confused, facing all these challenges. Along came an intrepid researcher who said, science, right? Dissolving their cares and concerns, and then everyone holds hands and marches happily down the path into the future. I think we all know it does not happen this way far too often for far too many of us. What's more likely is you come in and you say science, and they say, nah, I've got other things to do. So you try and jazz it up with a little more energy or make it sexy, and still nothing. And so with increasing frustration, yelling more loudly, starting to get bitter, what you see sometimes is some of that resistance, frustration, turning toward you as the messenger. And so ultimately, we end up in this situation of, where are we? Where do we go from here? So some of the things I'm going to be talking to you about today are the social science of what we understand about communication. But I want to wrap it in this package of storytelling. And storytelling is one of those words that raises a lot of hackles among research audiences. I think this is for a couple of reasons. One, we associate it with childish things, or worse, hand-waving, right? Like if your data doesn't stand up, then you do a little storytelling and it's a signal, it lacks rigor, sometimes is what we think that means. And so I often have scientists, communicators saying to me, we just need to give them the facts. We need to give it to them clearly, without the jargon, but if we do that, that is not only the way to make it work, but also it's the only honorable way to go about science communication. And so I like to sort of show you some of the data and point you to some of the research about this. So this is an implicit mental model that we have. For example, if you think about climate change, our assumption is that you have high science literacy, or if you really know how to read graphs, if you really understand math, then you're going to see a high perceived risk, right? That the problem here is scientific illiteracy. And if we could just fix that, then they would be concerned. So that's the presumption. And then here's the actual data. This is work by Dan Kahan in Nature Climate Change. There is no correlation between levels of concern around climate and sort of scientific literacy, numeracy, or degree of education achieved. You can break these results down, in fact, so I'll contradict myself a little bit. Among Democrats, you do see an increasing level of concern. So political ideology has a strong influence on how people respond to questions about cultural issues, about topics that have become entangled with badges not of what we know, but rather of who we are. And so, I presented this last year, this might be familiar to some of you, and in that case I was arguing we need to go from this assumption that people have a deficit of knowledge, that they're empty vessels waiting to be filled, and to recognize that in fact they're overflowing with thoughts and connotations and conflicting information, and we need to move to a dialogue-based model. Now here's the opportunity, again, for me to take a step off of my soapbox and think about what that meant to me as a person. So one of those, ideologically conservative Republicans is my dad. And so, family album time. Here's my father. He's a military guy, he was Air Force, he was a prosecutor. So I'm just giving you little clues, but you're already building a worldview of the kind of person who might be a prosecutor in the armed forces and is a conservative Republican. You would probably be right in many of those assumptions. I do remember, hi Dad, I'm going to tell the story. I'm the oldest of 5. Him walking down the line, we were stood up and he said, if you ever do drugs, I will kill you, I will bury you, I will dig you up, and I will prosecute you myself. So, as you might imagine, as I went through grad school and my own worldview started changing, not only did our political views diverge, but so did the media sources we were listening to. And pretty rapidly, I found that we would be spending too much of our time arguing over the dinner table, just throwing sound bites back and forth about climate. And in fact, there was one Christmas morning, you can think of how lovely that should be, where I was over 30 years old and I had to send myself to my room because of the kind of language I was using at the breakfast table on Christmas Eve morning over climate change. But the thing is, I could never find the right data. I could never find the right facts, the right graphs, the right expert to change my dad's mind about this. And when we finally had a breakthrough, it was because I kind of let that go and I was just so frustrated and I said, Dad, I love you. Do you think the talking heads on TV care about us at all? Do you think I'm stupid? How many years of schooling have you supported me through? I know these scientists. I haven't read all the papers. I don't know all the data. I know these researchers. And that was where we started to connect. His stance has softened. It has, the worldview has not shifted. There's lots of other issues where we don't see eye to eye on still. But we're proud to have made this breakthrough here. Where I made a choice, that was interesting, was I told that story to a journalist. And in fact, it ended up in a cover story for National Geographic and in the Washington Post, and I had to call my family and say, remember how we used to fight about climate change? I kind of talked about that. But we actually see this as a source of pride because we feel like this is quite emblematic of many, many people around the world and in this country in particular. How many of you have friends and family members who are just at loggerheads over any of the hot button science issues? Many, if not most of us, right? So there's lots of pieces to explore in this, and I will continue with that, but I want to take a step back and say, I should have known better than thinking I was off the record with a journalist, because me, of all people, I teach people how to talk to journalists, many of whom are in the room here today. This is Christopher Joyce sitting in the audience interviewing Christy Croker. One of the hard things in the workshop that we do is exactly what that experience with National Geographic suggested. I told a personal story, and it got picked up and quoted in the piece. And I was thinking, all the citations I gave Joel Achenbach about all the social science research, and he went after this. Of course he did, right? Of course he did. And I'm glad he did, but it didn't make it easier at the time. In our book, Escape from the Ivory Tower, which some of you are familiar with, we have an essay on this by Michelle Nyhouse, who's also one of our journalists in the room today, sitting in the back, about why be a character. You know, all of our science training is teaching us to remove ourselves, to be as objective as possible, to make it not about us. And there's also the social pressure of your labs and your colleagues. They don't, you know, there is a lot of opprobrium against seeking attention and taking credit where it's not due in science, which is good. But this is where we sort of start getting to the importance of characters in storytelling. So how many of you remember Where the Wild Things Are? All right, I see some very enthusiastic nods. Somebody in like 30 seconds shout out, what is the story? Just like give us the top line of the story.
Max doesn't want to eat his dinners. He gets sent to his room and he gets mad, and then he makes his wild things twice.
Right. So the elements of story, when you sort of boil it down to the simplest configuration, almost always begins with character. Bad little boy named Max. He's a terror. He's chasing his dog and doing all sorts of things. There's the scene, right? So the vines grow up the wall. There's a sailboat. He goes to the wild jungles. Another important element of story is time, right? It's bounded. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so the beginning of Where the Wild Things Are is Max getting sent to his room without supper. And then he goes off and has his wild adventure, and it all comes to conclusion when his supper is warm and waiting for him after he's safely home. The final element of story, and this is one that is really challenging, I think, for us in a science context, even though it does lend itself quite well to science reporting, is drama, tension, some sort of conflict and resolution. This is a touchstone. When you hear people talking about what is story, we could easily have spent the hour together just going through all the different definitions and how do we constrain what is story. It really has, for me, comes down to two things, characters and causality. So there has to be some sort of change from the beginning to the end of the story. And usually it's achieved through a problem that our main characters must confront and solve and learn something from or fix. And so in science, what's so challenging is sometimes we have to struggle to figure out not only, okay, we ourselves as researchers need to be characters in the story, but also how do we parse this complex world? How do we take all the ideas in front of us and winnow it down to one satisfying bite that people can remember and will attract them in to want to learn more about your research? And so going back to my coral reefs, with a grouper, think about it as isolating, all right, instead of the whole picture, we'll think about the character, the fish, or perhaps the diver. Think about the scene. We'll think about these digestible parts of the story that allow people to connect. And this is where we often find ourselves as scientists getting uncomfortable because we're making decisions about what to leave in, what to take out, and this is where it starts to open up the challenges of, are we cherry picking? Storytelling is all about the gaps and the ways that people fill in information with the presumptions and the associations that they come up with outside of the specific words that you're saying. So here is a place where we need to be very cautious and ethical as science communicators about the choices we make in constructing stories. So one of the great storytelling masters is Vonnegut, and there's this lovely video of him giving a lecture on a thesis that he actually had rejected about, quote unquote, the shapes of stories.
Well, there's no reason why the simple shapes of stories can't be fed into computers. They are beautiful shapes. This is the GI axis, good fortune, ill fortune. Sickness and poverty down here, wealth and boisterous good health up there. Here's the very middle. Now this is the BE axis. B stands for beginning. E stands for electricity. Now this is an exercise in relativity, really, is the shape of the curves of what matters and not their origins. So we'll start a little above average, is why get a depressing person? We'll start, the whole thing, we call this story Man in Hole, but it needn't be about a man, and it needn't be about somebody getting into a hole. But it's just a good way to remember it. Somebody gets into trouble, gets out of it again. People love that story. All right, not copyrighted. Another story, also a beautiful curve and easily fed into a computer, called Boy Gets Girl, but it needn't be that. Just a way to remember it. Start on an average day, average person, not expecting anything to happen a day like any other. Find something wonderful, just loves it. Oh, God damn it. Got it back again. People like that. Now, these are beautiful curves, and this gets a little complicated. Computers can now play chess, so I don't know why they can't digest this very difficult curve I'm going to draw for you now. And it so happens that this is the most popular story in our civilization, Western civilization, as we love to hear this story. Every time it's retold, somebody makes another $1 million. You're welcome to do it. Now, surprisingly enough, I've said it's depressing. You know, people don't like stories below average days and people. But we're going to start way down here. Worse than that, who is so low? It's a little girl. What's happened? Her mother has died. Her father has remarried a vile-tempered, ugly woman with two nasty daughters, big daughters. You've heard it. Anyway, there's a party at the palace that night. She can't go. She has to help everybody else get ready. She has to stay home. Now, does she sink lower? No. She's a staunch little girl, and she has had the maximum whack from fate, which is the loss of her mother. She can't go any lower than that. Okay, so the fairy godmother comes. Gives her shoes, gives her stocking, gives her mascara. Gives her means of transportation. Goes to the party. Dances with the prince, has a swell time. Boring, 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 boring. Now there's a slight inclination to that line as I've drawn it because it takes perhaps 20 seconds, 30 seconds for a grandfather clock to strike 12. Does she wind up at the same level? Of course not. She will remember that dance for the rest of her life. Now, she poops along on this level till the prince comes, the shoe fits. She achieves off-scale happiness.
Have you seen that one before? It's pretty great. There's a full transcript that we can share if you're interested. There's a lot more to that than that. But what I love is that what Vonnegut says in the rest of that talk is that it's not only that there's this power to abstract stories and to look at those shapes and think, oh, isn't this interesting, these fundamental blueprints, if you will, for what stories might look like, but that also how different cultures might have different shapes that are characteristic. And I thought that was a beautiful idea. But he's also fully aware of the perils of getting too prescriptive about these things and thinking that we have, the answer to everything. And in fact, so at the end of this, he says, the question is, does this system of mapping story shapes help us in evaluating literature? And so from that, I would say in life or science communication. And he says, perhaps a real masterpiece cannot be crucified onto a cross of this design. And I think the language here starts to get us to the place where we feel this real tension about stories, because there is this sense of stories are somehow, if not magical, they're deeply powerful. That they are engaging parts of our brain that are very emotional, that are connected to things like childhood, to pride, to love, to fear. And many of us come from backgrounds which assume that all emotions are the enemy of logic and reason. And you hear this in a lot of the rhetoric around why we're facing such challenges and struggles on different hot-button science issues these days, or that people are emotional. And if only we could, take the emotion out of the conversation, that then that would be fair, that would be right. And so stories are somehow incompatible with that kind of a worldview. One of the things that I really like, however, is that stories reflect the shifting nature of our conservation challenges and also what it means to be a scientist as well. So telling personal stories of who we are and how we came to these careers is really valuable and important. It's why I opened this talk this way. And so I want to play for you another film.
So I grew up in South Central in the shadow of the LA riots. I didn't think about the future much. By the age of 15, stared down the barrel of a gun 2 times. In order to get out of detention, I had to join Eco Club. And that turned out to be the best decision of my life. I came home a different person. And now, I'm a bridge between nature and the streets. I'm just trying to teach kids that it's cool to play in the dirt. I'm Juan Martinez, and I love nature like I love my hood, and I'm a National Geographic explorer.
I could give you any number of different people coming from all sorts of different backgrounds talking about their conservation science, their science story. I think the ability to tap into this is what's so exciting and gives me hope for making change. We often in our circles argue for, stagnation. We've been having these same conversations for how many decades? How do we change? I look at things like this and I feel hope. And so for me, this was part of why I bridged to my new position at the Story Collider. So the Story Collider is a nonprofit organization. We have standing shows in London, New York, Boston, LA, and San Francisco. We also have traveling shows. We're dedicated to the idea that true stories told live, personal stories about science are powerful, from a whole diversity of viewpoints and perspectives, not only scientists on our stage. We also have a podcast that comes out once a month, and this is what it sounds like in the opening.
A science story.
Is that what your son is the
Both.
Right. I was so
And I just thought, well,
I figured it out.
it was that golden moment.
Because science was on my side.
And so our team comes from a variety of backgrounds. Our 2 co-founders were theoretical physicists, both of them PhDs, who also both separately happen to have backgrounds in stand-up comedy and improv theater. So we're coming at this from, we think of ourselves as basically like a theater organization. It is about entertainment. It's not, let us teach you some science and maybe we'll put some window dressing on it, but rather it is, let us tell our true personal stories about science in a way that we hope eventually makes people feel human connections, both to the researchers, to think about the role of science in their own lives, to make them feel empowered and connected to this sort of abstract, esoteric thing. that sometimes people consider to be science. And in the work that we're doing in terms of our trainings and workshops moving forward, not only do we bring sort of a, some of us have worked at TED before, others of us are Grand Slam champions at the Moth. So we have that kind of stage and MFA background, but we also are hoping to continue to bridge the divide, the work that I started at Compass, and Compass continues, on understanding when it comes to the art and science communication, where is that right balance between theory and practice? What do we need to know? What can I give you by the time you walk out of this room that might be helpful? So I often tend to break this down to think about attitudes, knowledge, and skills, and separating those. Developing skills is a much longer process. Attitudes and knowledge are things that we can work on here together today and in discussion with each other. The reason that attitudes matter so much, and this does come out of the psychology and social science literature, is because social norms are powerful. And what that means is all of us, no matter how independent, fiercely independent we think we are subject to the whims of our community. Our reputations matter, especially in science, our reputations matter. And so we are not, conservation science, environmental science are not the only people struggling with a disconnect between the values we say we hold and the things that we see happening, decisions in the tenure process, the kind of pressure that are being put on new faculty, or just limited resources that don't support the good work we want to do. Medicine is also really struggling with how do you train doctors that are collaborative with other healthcare professionals, that have good bedside manner, that think of patients in a holistic way instead of this paternalistic, sort of sexist, old school approach. And this paper got me so excited that I was live tweeting it as I was reading, because they talked about no matter how often we say we need to add these kinds of skills into our formal training curricula. In medicine, in science, across the STEM disciplines, the reality is that our formal curricula are only one element of the training that we put our students through. The other is called the hidden curriculum. And it's everything you pick up in the hallways, late at night over drinks, about what it means to be a professional in this space. Who are we? What do we know? What do we value? How do we act? How do we treat other people? Right? And as long as that hidden curriculum continues to be the same old ways of thinking and being, nothing is going to change, no matter how many classes you put the students through. And this is a powerful idea because too often I think scientists default to this idea that we are neutral, objective, third-party observers kind of to the world. And we forget that we have our own culture too. We forget that there are many other types of trees and not all of them are bent into the same shapes we are by the powerful winds blowing during our graduate training. Right? So this is about identity politics. And yeah, I'm stretching that metaphor. I'm just gonna have to sit there and listen to it. I put it this way though because how many of you have had training in philosophy or the social sciences? That's great. This is many more people in the room than I often get in a science talk like this. So I have been marching around telling everybody, if you only read one paper sort of to dip your toes into social science stuff, to think about the ways that storytelling and also the way you approach questions about conservation, read this paper. It's called A Guide to Understanding Social Science Research for Natural Scientists. And it helps walk you through a lot of the terms that if you're not trained in this discipline can trip you up and it just sounds like jargon to an unbelievable level. So the first level would be about ontology. That means what is reality? What is there for us to know in this world? And you can think of a space sort of between reality is concrete over here and reality is constructed over here. And then you can break that down sort of, relativism versus naive realism and everything in between. I'm going to spare you the details, but we'll share the paper if you're interested. So, what is the nature of reality? That's one part. The second is epistemology. So, how do we create knowledge? On one end, we think meaning inherently exists. We just have to uncover it, discover it. On the other end, we argue meaning is created, that it is held sort of within the subject, and you impose your meaning on an object that you're studying, right? Subjectivism versus subjectivism. And then finally, we have your philosophical orientation, right? Your perspective. And this on one end is that knowledge is deductive, value-free, and generalizable. And then on the other, knowledge is inductive, value-laden, and contextual. And depending on what kind of disciplinary backgrounds you have, you might understand why, if you're way on the end of all of these scales, you can feel really frustrated and not understand many of the cultural conflicts that come into play, and not understand why stories have value or why they're important. And I think that one of the most important elements when we talk about storytelling is to know yourself. And Steve Schneider, the late great climate scientist Steve Schneider, who was a passionate advocate for climate science, used to always say he had only 3 pieces of advice when it came to science communication. Know your audience, know your stuff, know yourself. And so particularly when it comes to why are you communicating? What do you hope to achieve? There's a lot of room for very critical self-examination in there. Some of the best data I know about right now comes from Anthony Dudo and John Besley, who are doing research onto the goals of scientist communicators. Their sample size so far has largely been looking at AAAS numbers, so it's skewed a little bit, but what we're finding is that there seem to be 5 primary goals that are articulated when people say, why do you personally try to communicate science? The first 2, to educate or defend science, they've sort of classed as traditional goals. And then the last 3, to excite, to build trust, or to tailor messages, these are somewhat more strategic. And they're numbered the way they are because of their prevalence. So this is just early data, but it's showing in the gray here how you report your own priorities. We all think we care about everything more than everybody else does. But you can see that defense and knowledge are those primary 2. I think personally that this feeling that we're under attack, this overheated rhetoric about the war on science, puts us into a negative space. Right? I say us is sort of like the science-committed community. Because if you feel like you're under attack, you start getting defensive. You start trying to figure out who your allies are, and then you want to go on the offensive and attack. And too often, I really do see people sliding, I think, down a path like this. Well, I just want to educate people. I just want to give them the facts. Well, why do you want to give them the facts? Well, because I want them to persuade them to do what I think they should be doing, given that they have the facts. And then from there, it starts getting into these areas of not respecting people's agency. And yes, I'm not saying this is easy at all. There are dire consequences for communities, for all of us, when people exercise, their personal agency and say things like, I don't want to vaccinate my children. But I think that the history of science is littered with really problematic examples of when we think we know best and can make decisions for other people, regardless of what they think or want or need, because we have the data, right? That just sets my teeth on edge. Now, I'm not saying that in place of data or in place of trying to educate, that we just replace everything with this sort of free-form story, happy, fuzzy times. It's really interesting to see how fast people will pivot on that, and they assume it's an either or. Either we have rigor and accuracy, or we tell great stories. And my challenge to you is, why can't you do both? I think you can. When you Google sort of like stories and storytelling, the power of story online, you can imagine what you get. All sorts of like feel-good posters. The universe is not made of atoms, it's made of tiny stories. Which, this is good. I have a Pinterest board, I like this stuff, it's just fun. I don't know what the actual original quote is. That's part of the fun of trying to hunt down any quote on the internet. Or you start seeing people like, okay, well, if we're not going to present it like this, we're going to strive towards like pseudoscience. And I think a lot of the neuroscience behind like the power of story is suspect. You see these graphics like this. How many of you have seen this one before? Everybody, left brain, right brain. I noticed this is Mercedes-Benz. Not to sort of point fingers, but I think we can do better in looking for evidence to support our claims about what storytelling is, how it works, where, when, and how it works. I'm going to show you just a little bit of this. Like I said, this is a work in progress now. Now we're into the space where I'm trying to understand what the current research is, where the edges are, what we don't know yet. and how we might bring those together. So on one hand, we have a lot of fMRI or brain imaging studies, things like putting people into an MRI machine, having them tell stories of their prom date. And the graduate student who was the teller, it involved like 2 boyfriends, a car crash, and fisticuffs. So my prom was not that exciting. And then other people then listening to the recording of that while they were in the fMRI and looking to see that you have basically sympathetic, your brain images look similar, that it's perspective taking. It's imagining yourself in the shoes of the storyteller. So our brains are lighting up in the same way as the person telling the story. Or you also have other examples of the ways in which our really evocative language is activating those same sensory areas of the brain, so that you talk about things being, it's been a rough day. You know, there's like haptic or tactile elements of that. Yeah, this was the bit about sort of the speaker and the listener and the neural coupling and our brains lighting up in the same way. I'm cautious about this stuff. This is not my space. I don't know these statistics. I know how easy it is to misinterpret the pattern of blood flow in a brain and to interpret results the way we want to see it. But I do think it's exciting. I do think we want to know more. And what's particularly interesting to me are the people who are taking it that next step further. So there's a paper by Michael Dahlstrom and Shirley Ho about the ethics of storytelling and using narrative persuasion for science communication. And it begins with this premise that we're just going to assume for now is true, that narrative communication is encoded using a unique cognitive pathway that is different from other kinds of packaging and storing information. And in opposition to sort of argumentative or evidence-based communication, stories have a number of advantages. What we understand, and we can give you the full rundown of citations on these if you are interested in learning more, is that we think stories are more interesting. They draw people in, and people pay attention more. They attend to characters, conflict, the rest of it. We believe that stories are more understandable, that people are more easily able to parse information and follow along what's happening, that they're more believable. And in fact, what we do know is that people will change facts to fit a story that they believe much more readily than they will disbelieve a story, even when those stories are labeled as fictional. So narratives have power. They're also more persuasive. And the persuasive element is quite interesting. In all of the work that I'm doing, persuasion is not manipulation, right? It is convincing someone to change their mind or an attitude or behavior based on their own free will because you've presented a compelling case to them. Especially in the instance of resistant audiences, like going back to that story about my dad, where climate was such this latent issue, right? What stories can often do, especially the fictional ones we're finding, is allow people to sort of let go of all the identity politics around what it means. They get transported into the story. Sorry, transportation is a jargon term for like feeling swept away in the narrative. And through that, they can explore what might be the likely motivations, internal states, and challenges that other characters are facing, and then bring the attitudes that they are sort of feeling around that back into the real world. So in a way, stories have a way of lowering barriers to persuasion. And all of these things mean, yeah, they are potentially, if they're powerful, therefore we have to be really cautious and thoughtful about how we use them. Again, that and rather than or in terms of precision and care. And so it reminds me very much of going back to the work that Compass is doing and helping researchers connect to policymakers, but also any kind of public communication you're doing. You may be asked, what's the meaning of this? We're really good at what we found. It's harder to say what is the meaning or what should we do now that we have it. We think of this in terms of a tightrope when it's questions of what's the difference between science communication and advocacy. Where are those lines for you? They're deeply personal, right? I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. There's many different kinds of science communication roles and scientist roles in our world. When you start looking to the literature for sort of ideas that might be useful to you, in addition to Roger Pilkey's Honest Broker, which many of you know, I would really point you to recent work by Simon Donner, who's a Leopold Fellow, like Diana. And this is about a science advocacy continuum, rather than thinking of these as discrete states that you adopt for your entire career or for big times. He talks about what this might look like in terms of the normative judgment. So these mean value-based decisions we all are making every time we're communicating science. So up on the top end, sort of more pure research, and down here, more about advocacy. You can think about the kinds of questions you are asking and answering that shape how much of your own perspective is being conveyed in what you're doing. And so the next way to lay this out here, as you can see this, science on that end, advocacy on this end, objective judgments down here, normative, subjective things here, and as you go, the scientific uncertainty, the professional risk, and the influence of your worldview all increase. You can think of storytelling as inhabiting this same entire spectrum, right? You can do it in very rigorous, careful, cautious ways here, or you could be using stories as powerful tools to convince people of sort of your advocacy goals. I think what it comes down to is your own intention. So I've recently spent some time at the Institute for Science and Global Policy presenting my case that when we talk about what skills scientists should be trained in, when we talk about science communication, I think narrative persuasion is an excellent place to start because it forces us to grapple with the really uncomfortable questions of, do we ever want to persuade? Do scientists ever want to be telling stories? And I'm looking at your faces in the room to try and get a sense of this because I have seen the entire spectrum from people from professors swearing that even though they teach evolution, they have never tried to persuade anyone of anything in their entire life. To other people saying, we all tell stories constantly. You're engaging in intellectual sophistry if you deny it, right? So this is something I think you as a community can have a lot of really cool debates over coffee and beers over the next year. To close, though, I want to share one Compass perspective and one Story Collider perspective. So Pam Matson, who's a dean at Stanford and also leads the Leopold Leadership Program, argues that we all need to be advocates for the use of science in decision-making. And I feel like this has driven my own career shift. I feel like the best available science right now is telling me that storytelling is critical, it's powerful, it's overlooked in some ways, that we can teach it in a much more rigorous way, that there's a lot of work to be done there. So I'm excited. And then for the ending, I spent this whole time talking about us as storytellers and thinking about the ethics related to the audience. I think there's another dimension here as well. So this is a bit of a hot button, and I'm intending to be directly provocative to some of the journalists in the room. But this is David Sokka.
I hopped off the train, ran as fast as I could, barged into my office door, and without even saying hello to my lab mates, picked up the phone and dialed into the conference line. Hello? Hello, this is David. On the other end of the line was a journalist who had been asked to write about my story, to write about what motivated me to get into science and why I choose to study what I was currently studying today. Pretty much the kind of questions you get asked on the first date. I've been on a couple of first dates before and had a couple of these kinds of interviews, and I practically knew the answer to this question way before it was asked. But not this time. And when the journalist said, David, you grew up in Sierra Leone during the Civil War. Tell me about your childhood. I murmured some words like, I could talk about my childhood and I can talk about the war and yes, he quickly interrupted. You grew up in Sierra Leone, right? And you were there between 1991 and 2002 when the war ended. Yeah, so tell me about your...
He goes on to say, tell me about your childhood, right? These are questions that is absolutely legitimate for this journalist to be asking. And so David is a PhD candidate. He's researching how to make prosthetic limbs fit better on the human body without causing rawness and rubbing and marks, to make them more responsive. And here I'm just jumping sort of to the end of his story, because he closes on a note. I don't want to give him the last word, but I think this is important to think about.
Now, if this were a story that was being told by one of those journalists, the headline would read like this: MIT student from war-torn African country invents 3D printed prosthesis for the poor. While any one of those words, or a couple of those words could be true, they are not my own truth. Because what gets me to work every day is to think about how we can better connect the body to prosthesis. Think about it. Or just any interface. Your shoes still give you blisters. So if there's any one thing that I want you to take away from this story, it is that my curiosity and my interest in science started in surgical rooms, in Sierra Leone, and from football fields where I was playing in the rain, not while I was running away from bullets. I have since had a couple other interviews, and the journalist who was interviewing me more recently said, look, David, I know you don't want to talk about your experiences in the war and how it relates to what you're working on. I said, yeah, I don't want to, because I want us to focus on the research that's currently going. He asked the same question a couple times, and I chose to not focus on what he wanted to focus on. At the end, he said something like, you know what off the record means, right? I said, yeah, sure. I said, well, tell me off the record. Why don't you want to focus your story on the war? Because I will hate to look so foolish for not mentioning something so important, he said. They say only gods and fools don't change. I am no god, and I pray that he's no fool, but I insist. This is my story, and this is how I want it told. Thank you.
What's so fascinating to me is I have goosebumps standing up here and watching your reactions and to the beats of that piece. And when he said, the journalist said, oh, it's off the record, you guys laughed, right? Assuming that maybe there was some malevolent intent in that, or like maybe the tables were going to turn, something bad was going to happen. I hear in that story that is a journalist doing their job. That is a good journalist. And in fact, the first time I listened to this piece, I thought, David, I wanted to hear a little bit more about your childhood. You know, share that with us. Don't just say, no, I only want to talk about the research. But these are personal decisions. And this is up to you to figure out where the right balance is between your own experience, your own heart and soul, and this hard-earned knowledge that you're building. I just implore you, whether it is on your own or through all these different venues that we have, through journalists, through talking to policymakers, through talking to children, you know what? It's your story. Tell it honestly, tell it fully, tell it well. And so for both the Story Collider and Compass, thank you so much.
Everybody, thanks Liz. And Liz will take a few questions. Anybody has any comments?
So as a budding journalist student here, sometimes I feel like I have to really completely understand the paper that I'm reading in order to be able to tell the story to my readers. Mm-hmm. And then I get so happy and excited about the science that it's hard to kind of take it back out of the jargon. So what would you recommend as a way to kind of bridge that?
I'm going to turn the table and ask all of the journalists in the room to answer this question. So Susan, Michelle, Dan, Chris, how do you deal?
Well, one thing you could do is, when you found that you deep dived into this thing and then you're starting, your head is spinning and you're adopting the language and the structure, go to your editor and start to describe the paper to your editor. And if your editor gets up and walks out, you've gone too far. And when you can, your editor is there for a reason. Your editor is supposed to play dumb. I have an editor who's the science editor at NPR. She has a master's degree from Oxford in English literature. And she's a great editor. Because when I start to get too complicated, she just goes dumb. And it's great because it keeps them honest.
Do you guys have any, could you hear that in the back?
Yeah, I could. And I second that word for word. That's what editors are for, is to be a test audience for us journalists, because we don't get as deeply into your research as you do, of course, but we get pretty deeply into it in order to be able to explain it properly. In order to be able to generalize about it properly, we have to understand it. So we need that test audience. Husbands are also good test audiences. Other people in your lives.
Right. So as people who may be interviewed, you will likely face the entire gamut of journalists, people who have advanced degrees themselves, people who've been on this beat for 25, 30 years and know it maybe better than you do, to people who've never read your paper and are on a very short timeline. The worst thing you can do is when somebody says, can you in your own words describe briefly what you found, is to say, well, didn't you read the paper, right? Don't ever start there. And so yeah, it is tricky, especially for those of us, steeped in it, because these ideas are so powerful. We learn this jargon, we are making implicit jumps and assumptions, we understand how the pieces fit together, talking to it through.
Can I add just one little quick thought on that too? Also, when reporters come to me and they've got a story about science and it's full of jargon and stuff that I'm not sure I understand, I know they don't understand it either. They're just borrowing from the paper because they don't get it. When a journalist can come to you and describe something in plain English, then I figure they understand it well enough to bring it down to or up or through the common language.
So, as a scientist and academic, we're always in the process of generating knowledge, gaining knowledge.
Yeah.
As you work across, I've worked internationally with different cultures, different peoples, and so I've come to recognize that communication, not only with journalists, but with the people that you're trying to work with and trying to gain knowledge from, that there's different modes of communication that go beyond our Western training. There's pictures. The stories is very important aspect. So how do you communicate that to a Western trained academic to understand the importance of culture and understanding the manner in which communication and knowledge generation in different cultures really does vary?
Thank you for that question. It's making me reflect on some of my own experience. I used to work in Fiji and Papua New Guinea, and I feel like when it comes to helping people who think that Western culture is the default and correct, sometimes they learn the hard way when they just can't get anything done. The approach that I've taken is to try and look into the research around why do visuals work and how do people look at them. And there's some really interesting stuff about preferences for like a soul figure close up versus in a landscape when you look at Eastern and Western cultures. I think it's always a process of meeting your audience where they are. And so I look to people who have extensive experience in both worlds. I look to bringing in unique matchmakers who can bring, like Catherine Hayhoe, for example, in climate science, is able to tap into evangelical Christian beliefs and have pastors be the people that she's talking to. So yeah, I don't know how you start cultural appreciation with someone who just absolutely doesn't believe that there's any value there. My hope is those people are becoming less and less prevalent and that we will see change over time. Does that? Yeah.
Just one back up.
this is sort of an extension of his question, but one of your slides showed the difference in the appreciation of science based on political lines. And my curiosity is, do you feel that the fact that so many public intellectuals have openly antagonized, especially the right's fundamental belief systems, plays a role in the fact that they discredit what science offers? And if so, is that now our responsibility to start mending that bridge?
Yeah, that's a really interesting and hard question. And so first I'll take issue with one of the fallacies that I think many of us commit is assuming that there is an anti-science right, quite frankly. That there are these entire packages of worldviews. That means you see anti-science beliefs on lots of different dimensions. And that just doesn't hold up the same way that we would expect it to. So the first thing I think is understanding which beliefs are correlated and what kinds of people hold those, and being respectful that it's not this entire political party we're going to dismiss because different elements of it are, going against the best available data on specific issues. As for whether we're inflaming these things and making it worse, I'm sort of two minds of this, and I would love to keep talking about it. On one hand, I've never seen anyone change their mind because someone was screaming at them and insulting them. I mean, when's the last time you changed your mind about something big? Really think about that. I'll ask for forgiveness to tell one more quick story. I was in a wedding party. I was doing a reading. I sat down at the rehearsal dinner next to my partner. He was a Marine. I ordered, and his head snapped like a snake, and he looked at me, he's like, I had you pegged as a vegetarian the second you walked in here. And I was like, oh, great. And he wanted to talk climate and evolution. And now it's my college roommate's wedding. I'm not ready to talk about the facts of, the evolution in the detail he wanted to. So I ended up having to do the same kind of thing, why do you believe that? But by the end of the night, and I'm sure alcohol had something to do with this, he was hugging me and he said, no one has ever talked to me about this stuff before without screaming at me and telling me I'm stupid. I'm not sure about the whole climate thing still, but I think you've got me on evolution. So that was the biggest win for me. So that being said, that's my approach, what works for me. There's some interesting sort of thought that comes out of conservative think tanks. There's something called the Overton window. If you imagine a spectrum of every possible solution to a policy challenge, at any given point in time, only a subset of those are plausible, right? Acceptable. And so that window moves and opens or narrows over time depending on how we're acting. And sometimes loud, extreme voices change the shape of that Overton window. And so I'm hesitant to say that all of us should all be adopting exactly the same tactics and we should all be nice and sweet and polite all the time. I just don't think that holds. So I think it's about experimentation, right? Treat this as a research challenge. Are the ways that you're approaching the questions you're being asked making any difference? And if you're beating your head against a wall for years, maybe that suggests that you should reject that hypothesis.
There was another question back there. Okay.
I just graduated with my BA in philosophy.
Oh,
so I just took a class about animal research and the ethics of animal research. And something we discussed is the frustration of ethicists trying to communicate their views to scientists. So I'm curious about your perspective on what obligation you feel you have as a scientist, or the scientist should have, to be on the other side of this, basically. What kind of perspective can you give for someone who's interested in that other side of communication?
Yeah. I'm not sure how to answer that, but I will say that what has really appealed to me and what I find gets the most traction is to make the argument that we're all academics, we're all intellectuals for a reason, because we believe that the life of the mind is vibrant and fascinating and wonderful. And that if we're not challenging ourselves and looking at the world through different perspectives, we're stagnating and we're probably missing something important. And so what I often find is that people are just overwhelmed and thinking given everything else that I have to do, I don't have time to engage on yet one more front, especially if it's really antagonistic, if I'm afraid I'm going to get attacked, if I'm having to read papers that are chock full of jargon, and so I think we're building bridges in every direction all the time. And so I just challenge scientists to say, in many of our most pressing, urgent issues, we're outgunned, people have more money than us, they've got more famous people talking more loudly, they're not bound by the truth in the same strictures that we are. You know, we should fall back on what we do have, which is our science, which is our best available ethics, which is our social science, and to come at it from that perspective.
Let's take,
Yeah, we're running out of time, so.
You mentioned the persuasive power of fiction earlier. Yeah. I was just wondering if you knew of anybody in the climate science world who is making and disseminating persuasive fiction.
I do. I don't have that off the top of my head. I think
Naomi Oreskes is one.
So fiction, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean maybe we could crowdsource a list or something like that. What's your name?
Matt.
Matt. Anybody who has answers for Matt, find him.
From 40 degrees to below zero and 50. It's a series of fictional books about climate change and.
I bet
I think it's called 40 degrees.
I know people who are building interactive games based on like voicemails from the future and things like that. So I think there's lots of cool stuff happening. Climate is not my space. I don't know it that well.
So, I just want to toss out maybe even a more radical idea for going from storytelling to story making. What do you think of the idea of taking people with all these diverse perspectives when you're dealing in a sustainability question that's both uncertain on the science and controversial on the value and ethics side? What do you think of the idea of throwing that mix of people together at the front end to figure out what the story is people actually want to hear?
I think that sounds like excellent radio, and I know some people working on projects very much along those lines. I do think, really this is about our values, and putting mine on the table, I believe in democracy, and I believe that it works. I believe we have to respect people even if they come to radically different conclusions than we do based on the best available evidence. I think there's some deliberative processes that are really quite interesting in how you bring people together. I know that the best social science is showing that if you structure these deliberations properly, even if the ultimate decision goes against people's preferences, if they feel validated, if they feel heard, if they feel like this is a legitimate process, they will be more satisfied with those outcomes. And that's a kind of future that I hope we can see. So for me, it all comes down to storytelling is about a lot of different things. It's about our identity, it's about packaging stories about who we are and how we survive and disseminating those over space and time. They're the best mechanism that our species have evolved for taking information, making it appealing, and making it shareable, making other people want to share it. In the science sense, we know that stories are about collective sense making, that often during times of ambiguity, as we collectively try and figure out what's going on, like I saw this on a plane the other day. I was getting in the boarding line, there was a fight, these guys were rolling around on the floor, and then it was fascinating because it was like this linear process. You could hear the story percolate down the line onto the plane, and then as I was boarding, you could hear people telling each other, what happened? Oh, it was this way. Oh no, it was the old guy, like that. So stories are about collective sense making, and that's what science is as well. And so I'm so glad to see all of you here today, and I really look forward to seeing how these discussions will